Welcome back to The Whole Person Revolution, a podcast of Comment Magazine. I'm your host, Ann Snyder, and today, as we continue this summer season peeling back the layers on the onion that is social change, and I should caveat, of course, that there are almost infinite different kinds of onions as we look at different epochs and historical examples, we want to cut to the core of this notion of change itself. Why are we late modern people, but perhaps especially we North Americans, seemingly obsessed with change? Have we inadvertently begun to treat change, be it technological in nature or our own perpetual self-reinvention, as an end in and of itself? Have we lost a sense of what any given change is for? With me to help explore this more philosophical question is Doug Yacek, a research fellow at TU Dortmund University in Germany, and the author of Comment's featured essay this week titled Transform Thyself. The essay is cheeky yet perceptive. It pokes at the latest buzzword to flood the conference circuit and education circles, namely that education should be, quote, transformative. Here's how Doug begins the piece, quote, when educators wax poetic about the aims and goals of education, they almost always say the same thing. They say that education should prepare students to compete in an increasingly complex global job market. It should provide them with the knowledge and skills they need to face the challenges of the 21st century and achieve their dreams. It should make them critical thinkers and creative problem solvers, maybe even help them become, quote, their own boss. And he goes on to say, but there is a new phrase in education quickly becoming a go-to inspirational motif. When administrators or teachers really want to emphasize education's potential, they are increasingly calling it transformative. The new mantra is that education should profoundly change how students see the world, that good teaching does not just add knowledge and skills to students' pre-existing perspective. Good teaching transforms this perspective. So, listeners, that may sound innocuous, even refreshing, right? Well, yes, but also not so fast, according to Doug. He has agreed to join the Whole Person Revolution today to interrogate why transformation for its own sake, without any specificity, may just not be enough. So, Doug, it's so good to meet you out of the editorial margins of our Word documents and backs and forth on your piece. It's an honor to work on that with you, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Anne.
So I just gave a little intro, and I kind of, as you know, shaved out just there some of the more cheeky, fun way in which you introduce even this argument, which I will let listeners whet their appetite to toggle over and check it out in full. But I want to just revisit the argument in this essay and so much of your work, as I understand it now as a philosopher. Sort of what's at the core of your critique of sort of this more trendy, quote, transformational mantra when specifically applied to education?
Yeah, that's a great question because the language of transformation in education is something that really raises our spirits. And I think for good reason. When we think about our favorite teachers in school or in college, we often want to describe them as transformative because they did have an impact on our lives. They've profoundly influenced us. We're different people as a result of their inspiration, as a result of the friendships or relationships that they cultivated with us or with their discipline. We might have changed what we thought we should do with our lives as a result of sort of developing or being in that classroom experience. And so talking about transformation in education is completely natural and I think really justified. And yet at the same time, there's a kind of paradox in this language and in the consistent reference to sort of transformative teaching and learning, which is how it comes up in the research community today. And the paradox is something like this. So if you look at over the last 30 years of educational rhetoric, what you often hear are things like education should prepare young people for a fast and changing world, for new kinds of work, for technology. It should sort of awaken an entrepreneurial spirit. We should become our own boss. We should shape our own futures as a result of what we're getting in the classroom. And there's a lot of good in that language. But there's been a shift in how we talk about what education should do for us over the last 5 years or so. And it's shifted more to the transformation talk. And what I think is sort of surprising about that is that at the same time that we've seen this rhetorical shift, there's a lot of concern about indoctrination. We've seen a huge debate come out about critical race theory and its role in schools. Interestingly enough, both sides of that debate are worried about different kinds of indoctrination. The one, because there's structures of oppression and racism embedded in schools and the education system that needs to be interrogated and brought out. The other side saying, no, the theories that we need to do that are themselves indoctrinatory. So both sides actually agree that indoctrination is a problem. And yet, on the other hand, we're praising transformative teaching and learning, transformative teachers. And it begs the question, is this really something we want to give teachers a license to do? Raises ethical questions. It raises questions about really what role subject matter has to play in the classroom and the extent to which subject matter or disciplines, academic disciplines, can actually change us in that way. So in the piece, I try to get at a little bit of that paradox, particularly as it arises when people try to spell out what transformation really means.
Well, it's interesting because you and I both probably inhabit worlds, you in the academy, me sort of as a student of institutions, a storyteller. I've thought a lot about organizational culture and the yin and yang between an individual's agency and an institution's conditions. And there's a lot of folks out there, not just in sort of religious spaces, who are wringing their hands at what they feel like is a loss in understanding of formations, which, and I think you talk to many faculty at many more mainstream or secular universities, and they'll say, no, we're not in the business of formation. We are trying to share our expertise, but that gets into sort of the moral domain that makes us uncomfortable. And then others who are like, no, education should be formative. So that's happening. And there's a sense that there's this kind of widespread atrophying of pedagogical muscles, let alone conviction that that's part of what an education is for. And yet this much more dramatic word, that transformation, which may happen gradually, but I think we all hear it and we think that there's something about that that's like a lightning flash. Somehow that's the sexy thing. And so anyways, I'm curious what you think is behind sort of today's attraction to this notion of transformation. Is there something kind of going on in the water of our time, and as it applies to education, a sort of running out of the thread on Western industrial education models that makes this notion of, quote, transformation, however that's defined and towards what end, sort of glisten with sort of a new sheen in a generation that feels quite exhausted by utility-based arguments?
Yeah, I think there's a lot behind it. The first thing is that I think we live in a time of tremendous social and cultural upheaval. The pandemic was really an experience for all of us that profoundly changed just the everyday processes of life. It closed us down into our homes, that we began to then realize maybe we're not quite in the order they needed to be, or our relationships with others. Also, just the stuff about AI that's coming out and the questions that has raised for many of us, for people's jobs, for education, the role that these powerful technologies will now play in teaching and learning. These are difficult things to grapple with, and they seem to, in a way, kind of shift the ground from underneath us. And one way of addressing these concerns is to kind of transport them and sort of redefine them or reinterpret them as potentially positive. We're sort of nervous about them, but maybe we could re-see them as actually this is what we're meant to do. We're meant to constantly change. We're meant to always stay up with the new technology. This is the essence of being human, the creative capacities to rethink what we're doing and re-see the world. So it's a kind of almost a rationalization of what we already experience in the postmodern world. But maybe more critically, you could also see it as a response to what you might call the monotony of modern stimulation. So we have these magical devices in our pockets called smartphones that have completely erased boredom from our world. We almost at any point when we feel the slightest lapse of concentration or attention, then bam, it comes out, and we're engaged with a conversation with an old friend, or we're checking an email, we're playing a game. I personally have an addiction to chess on my phone, which I'm not proud of. But I'm saying it here live so that I can begin the process of getting better about it. And somehow transformation promises something deeper than these more superficial forms of stimulation. And yet it's in the same kind of logic. It's sort of like, this could be something more. And this gets at, I think, the third and most important part about transformative education, or the transformation rhetoric in education. That is that it really does tap into to a fundamental human longing for connection to intrinsic sources of value and meaning. I think transformative education, transformative teaching is positively connoted for a good reason. We want to have experiences with teachers in classrooms that edify us, that enrich our lives, that show us the power of mathematics and social studies and literature. And I think that just is something that's emphasized in this language for good reason. The problem arises, though, in when people start to try to spell out what it means to transform students in the classroom. That's when things get a little bit dicey, because what you said previously about formative education and the worries that people have had, the normative burden of that. Well, what are we forming students into? That same thing, those same worries apply to people who are interested in transformative education and who develop theories about transformative teaching and learning. They also want to avoid getting too normative. We live in a pluralist world. There's lots of competing conceptions of the good. And so when they start to cash out what these profound educational experiences should look like, they become much less inspiring than the word itself. And one of the things I talk about in the article is that basically you see a shift in the rhetoric over the last 30 years in education, away from shaping your own future to transformation, but then how transformation gets defined is then shaping your own future. A transformative experience in education, according to the most influential theories out there today and models, is something that opens students' life possibilities, gives them more options. And that is just something that I think doesn't quite get at the real potential in this idea or concept.
Yeah, you have a wonderful section in this essay, and I'm just going to pull out 2 sentences from it, where I think you are pushing back on that notion of transformation de facto means an opening up of options and possibilities. And you say, if we reflect on experiences that have actually exerted a transformative effect on our lives, we generally focus on the very opposite of increased options or choices. We speak of the new commitments that the experiences have made possible. I sort of have been formed by, interestingly, a rabbinic interpretation of Genesis that says, we each were born with two Adams within us. Adam 1 being the seek after mastery and success and victory and, commanding a domain of expertise, more to some degree. And then there's this either often through crisis or profound suffering or a deep love. There tends to be in most of our lives some transition to climbing a second mountain and or this discovering this other Adam within us, which is the part of us that desires to quiet ourselves, to tie ourselves down, to attach, to surrender ourselves to a person or a cause greater than ourselves. And just even in my own life, I don't think I'm unique here, but, when people may ask, what was an annunciation moment in your own vocation, I will refer to a kind of both and experience of, happened to be digging ditches to help build a water system collaboratively with a village in rural Honduras. And I remember vividly this feeling of, so I was going to commit my life to a God who would suffer with us, and commit my life to sort of a certain set of pain points in the human experience, not out of some masochism, but out of a deep sense of there's something crystallizingly true about the nature of love I'm discovering paradoxically through this kind of suffering person, these impoverished relationships and so on. And I'm sort of struck by how it was a tying down. I'm just affirming your point. And I think most of us would say it's a tying down that actually allows us to be reborn into perhaps who we were meant to be or what we were meant to serve. I mean, these gets into more spiritual questions of calling and so on. But it's interesting how that's, when you say it up front, it's very un-American, I think quite anti-modern.
Yeah, right. Yeah, the commitment that ultimately liberates, the tying down that frees us, that's the seeming contradiction that is actually a deep wisdom, I think, in Christianity and other world religions as well. And I think it is something that our zeitgeist sort of misses. The idea that opening up possibilities is always what human freedom looks like.
Right.
That's a problem. And one point you were getting at a bit earlier too, that, these concerns about, the ways we shape students or young people when we are coming with these kinds of wisdom or these kinds of experiences we've had ourselves. That you can never avoid actually the normativity of the classroom. You can never avoid somehow embodying what you've learned in your life and what you feel is right. And just to take an example, so the standard definition of transformative education is the kind of education that sort of breaks down some of your assumptions and your expectations, your previous values, and also some of your prejudices and things like this. It breaks them down or calls them into question and then opens up the possibility for new ones to take their place. And that sounds great, but at the same time, this is a deeply ethical position, actually. It has a really concrete understanding of what a good human life looks like. And what it seems to me is that it has the tendency to devalue commitment. It tends to devalue deep attention to things that we're already invested in and that we already care about. And it kind of devalues a sort of self-integrity. This idea that the more we open things up and bombard ourselves with possibility, the more difficult it becomes for us to actually be dogged about what we know matters and what gives us life and what makes us feel good in the world. I also want to say that your experience that you recounted was really beautiful. But I'm just reading now Master and Man by Tolstoy again. I don't know if you've read that, but it's a beautiful short story from the end of his life. And there's a scene where it's about basically a landowner, an aristocratic landowner, and his peasant serf, and they're caught in a blizzard, and things are looking pretty bleak. Their horse is exhausted and can't go on any further. They're caught in a snowdrift. And the landowner has just lived basically a kind of fairly superficial life and is generally concerned about business matters and always looking for the next business opportunity and mildly exploiting everybody he comes into contact with because he's a little bit smarter than them and he can kind of get the upper hand. And as he's confronted with the prospect of his death, he undergoes a transformation. The peasant servant that he has with him, Nikita is his name, is just sort of recognizes the inevitability of the situation where Vasily, the landowner, is sort of agitated and concerned. He tries to escape with the horse and ends up going in a circle. Anyway, what happens is that he realizes that in these last moments of his life, what he could best do is not try to escape and preserve himself, but actually commit himself to Nikita, the person that's actually supposed to be serving him. And he goes and he lays down on him and he warms him with his body and warms him back to life. And the landowner actually ends up dying as a result. But in those last moments, he recognizes this wisdom that we become what we're supposed to become as human beings when we serve, when we sacrifice, when we love. And introducing another possibility for thinking about the human good, I just don't know if that brings us much further. And so if a theory of transformation is suggesting that, then I think we're missing something.
I really appreciate how this maps on to the undergirding motivation and interest that I had in commissioning the whole issue, exploring this question of cultural and social change. We called it Seedbeds of Social Change, the issue at large, partly because we wanted to just share some narratives of those early stage, often small groups of people who are trying to chart out a better way to live so that others might copy them, or a big idea that may be from the fringe that then becomes mainstream. What are the mechanisms early on? There's so little attention paid to those hidden beginnings. And going back to this contrast a little bit between formation and transformation, I think both are good. I'm very grateful for some transformational moments in my own life that I can name and point to as pivots, sometimes driven by an amazing teacher, sometimes, of course, driven by an experience of struggle or revelation, almost always relationally or communally rendered. But I'm wondering if our obsession with words these days, like transformational, or say in some other worlds I'm in, like philanthropy or certain kinds of nonprofits, they want to define all their work as catalytic, or it's like these dramatic sort of staccato, instant feeling notions of change that are very exciting to post about on Facebook and are there and make the news and have this public drama to them, good or ill, that like captures our attention and like yanks us out of our fear of boredom and the quiet and the disciplines and the commitments that are, maybe celebrated in a beautiful movie, often foreign films. But there is something about what you're saying also maps onto this logic that we're trying to draw out at Comment about sort of the deep value and freedom found somehow in these like quieter, more hidden, precious, often fragile underground filtering of something eventually perhaps like fully changing a society or fully converting a human being. But that is like often quite interior for a long time. And I just don't think we have either the mechanisms or sort of the cultural appetite to value that long, patient, hidden terrain these days.
Yeah, it's funny because when I first started to become interested in, I guess in some ways I've always been interested in transformation. I personally also went through several very important transformative experiences. I studied mechanical engineering at University of Texas, and I was on a path to a career at an oil refinery, and actually worked as a mechanical engineer for 1 year. at a refinery up in Washington State. And that was going to be a very lucrative life compared to the life I've chosen for myself, ultimately, as a philosopher. And but I was influenced by several teachers who sort of awoken a different kind of longing in me, or tapped into that longing that maybe was already there.
Yeah.
And they kind of gave me the courage to strike out and do something a little bit different, even though there were more uncertainties involved with it. And I'm so thankful for that. But it was an extremely long process, this transformation. And I found it kind of odd when I first got into thinking about this in an academic way, or kind of philosophically, to look at the various ways that people use transformative language, in that they often think about transformation as something happening very quickly. And the way I think about it is that often we do need experiences that sort of wake us up in a dramatic moment in which our perspective is momentarily shifted. We recognize, we see the light in a way, and I call this epiphany. We have these moments of epiphany, and those are tremendously powerful, but they are not all powerful. In my view, they do not complete the transformation. The transformation occurs over a long time. It requires deep psychological processes of restructuring, which we actually have new habits.
It's habitualized, yes.
It's re-habituating ourselves, exactly. And that is getting at, that I think is a fuller picture of what transformation, real human transformation, looks like. And I think also what you're getting at as well, these are slow processes of change, sometimes with dramatic impulses. That's what teachers often are able to do. They can't complete, in my view, the transformative process. They can, at best, inspire students by showing them how incredibly fascinating physics is, or how inspiring a great poem is, and awakening something in their students.
And desire and sort of moral sentiments. Yes,
that's right. And then giving them some tips and some structure during the rest of the semester or school year to start making some relationships with others where they can bolster that over time. But like I said, the full transformation is something that happens much more slowly.
Yeah, very well said. Christians have historically talked about transformation as the fruit of a life born again and discipled after Christ himself. And, I think we often use this word conversion as kind of a theological, if not more focused definition of the same concept of transformation. And I'm wondering, do you think the quote unquote secular imagination is able to ascribe a vision of the good and kind of moral normativity to the process of transformation? Or at some level, is it kind of intrinsically unable to do so?
Yeah, that's a really important question. It's kind of an issue I see come up in a lot of different areas of academic research, and particularly in education. What I mean is that the conversation about transformation isn't the only place where people who are trying to respect pluralism or the secularism of kind of the broader society have difficulties really becoming concrete about the kinds of things that help increase our flourishing and the kinds of things that are going to do the opposite. And so it's no surprise that we find that issue here. So, for example, another conversation I dabble in is sort of democratic education. And even there's a lot of talk about neutrality and
right.
The importance of recognizing various conceptions of the good, And the problem with that is it so seldom really inspires people to robust forms of democratic community.
Yeah, it's like the classic curse of procedural liberalism.
Right,
It's
exactly,
just
exactly.
sort of vanilla.
Yeah. And I just think we hamstring ourselves because, I mean, if we think democracy is all that, then I think we should really embody that and see it as a substantive appreciation of the equality of every human being, and to and really to recognize that when we subscribe to that kind of life, we flourish more as a community, as individuals. We have those moments like Vasily and Nikita, the master and man story, where we see, even though I'm rich and I'm well off and I am educated, that I am no better than this peasant person. In fact, this peasant here, as Tolstoy also describes, and has in many ways lived a more flourishing, more committed, more fruitful life, even though he's completely poor. And so at any rate, but the second thing I want to say is we cannot get around ascribing normativity, as you put it, to what we do in education. Normativity is always there. And even if we say, we want to be neutral educators, every single decision you make in the classroom is imbued with values, cultural values, social values, moral values, the way we discipline students, the way we emphasize certain topics in the curriculum. All of this is deeply moral.
Yes.
And so I think that, even especially in this conversation about transformation, there, at the very least, there needs to be the recognition that no matter what we say about it, we are subscribing to a certain ethical worldview. And then the next step is to ask, well, is this actually going to increase our flourishing or not?
Right.
And that's when I think we start to see the holes in many of the contemporary theories that have been offered.
I want to zoom out a little bit beyond just this notion of transformation and tie it to this broader question we, a commenter, asking around social change. And I want to go at it this way, which is, I think certainly in kind of the Western world, let's just say like the last 2,000 years, there has been a long-standing tradition, though you see it picked up in different strands, of the role of education in literally like creating a human being or forming a human being, how to become human. Education is key to that. And you see this sort of Greek notions of paideia, Roman notions of humanitas. You get sort of like picked up in the medieval era in the liberal arts, later in Germany, notions of Bildung. And I'm very interested in this as I'm trying to wrap my head around like a longstanding tradition of Christian humanism. And which has multiple projects involved in it, but one of which is the Formation Project. Over the last couple of years, I got clued into a group of, happened to be all men, mostly scholars, although some politicians and others, who met regularly in the years leading up to World War II in the 30s. And it was convened by a man by the name of J.H. Oldham. It's called Oldham's Moot. And it's kind of an example of this more hidden seedbed private conversation. And essentially, it was a group of folks who were horrified by what was happening in Germany, where you are right now, and just was like, we need to gather folks to just like really ask the timeless question again: what does it mean to be human? What do transcendent frame of reference have to do with that question? How do we deal with this sort of encroaching totalitarianism, strong men, dignity defying totalisms? What are the dynamics introduced by deepening secularization? So they were asking like large questions, and some of their you had people like T.S. Eliot and Reinhold Niebuhr would fly across the pond, a very famous Jewish German refugee sociologist, Karl Mannheim, would come, John Bailey, physicist. It's quite cross-disciplinary. And where they kind of landed, and there's sort of debate as to how successful they were, but they met from like 1937 to 37 to 47, around a decade, repeatedly, increasingly through logistical hardship, just to convene during the war. And they landed, they were basically like, we feel like if we're going to walk out of all these discussions about what's happening to our civilization, and sort of what the point and purpose of human life is when we're watching these horrors unfold. We want to say that education, and more specifically higher education, is absolutely central to develop a capacity to think seriously about the timeless questions that mark our humanity. So as I've been studying that group, I'm wondering, how do you understand the role of education in social change? Should educators be thinking of themselves as social change agents? Or should they be thinking of themselves as sort of formers of human beings, period?
A very important question. So to answer your question about how teachers should see themselves, I think it's absolutely essential that teachers see themselves as both social change agents and formers of their students, people that help form their students' characters. And the reason is this. So just take an example like the civil rights movement in the United States. That cannot get off the ground until we begin to shift our perspective profoundly. The cutting edge scientific research of the time was telling us that there are various races within humanity, and some of those races are intrinsically more valuable than others. We should build a society, if it's going to be most socially efficient, in which the better races are on top. That was the psychology of the day. And there was so much in society at the time to support that view. And yet, what it was that ultimately started to lead to real social change was a transformation of hearts and minds by influential leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., who were able to demonstrate in a powerful way that no, there are not different races that have different values and kind of social importances, but rather we're all brothers and sisters. And we are all of the same kind of moral worth deep down. And without that shift, nothing happens. And so in a way, education is the only thing that can motivate social change, in my view. It's the all important element that's missing from any Marxist view of things, because without that sort of the new consciousness that comes along with social progress, nobody buys in. And so teachers, I think, in their classrooms are in some ways the people that are making those shifts of consciousness possible. They show, if not always like explicitly. So when I feel that over time in my own life, I have become much more sensitive. I grew up in a middle class, well-to-do household and was basically living in a social bubble and had no concern for anybody else other than the people in my immediate circles. And over time, I've moved away from that. Luckily, I'm no longer in that bubble, though I'm still in a bubble, no question about it. I should be serving people much more than I am, and getting out of my kind of middle class lifestyle that I am comfortable in. But nonetheless, I've just been much more aware of the suffering and much more aware of other different kinds of lives, and the reason is that actually not because people have explicitly told me, oh, here's a theory of injustice or inequality in American society or German society, but because they found meaning and significance in things like physics or in literature. And paradoxically, that enthusiasm and excitement for things that really matter have had the effect of me just recognizing that these things that used to distract me, like video games or my own ambitions, or whatever it might be, baseball was a big thing. Those didn't have the same depth of meaning significance. And so then I just started out on a search for things that really matter. And one of the things that really matter are other human beings. And another thing that comes along with this is that, academic disciplines, physics, social studies, these are not just bodies of knowledge, they're communities, they're people in common pursuit over millennia,
yes,
of understanding the wonder and mystery of this world, of our conscious experience. And that uniting of people together just makes you much more look for deeper forms of community as well. It makes you look for real friendships and love. And so maybe it sounds a little romantic, but I really believe that, yeah, the more enthusiastic you are about teaching physics or social studies, the more you're going to contribute to actually creating a more just society, even though that connection isn't immediate. I'm just convinced of it.
That's a beautiful way to end, Doug. Thank you for that. And thank you for your own ongoing stretching of this dialogue over the ages, applied in a very timely way to maybe some of our fast and loose attractions of our day, specifically in education. So thank you. I've learned a lot from this conversation.
Well, thank you. And I've learned a lot as well.
Thanks for listening to The Whole Person Revolution, a podcast of Comet Magazine. Our overarching mission is to foster an imagination for a thriving society. We publish pieces by cultural luminaries and pioneering practitioners. We equip and convene leaders through forums, dinners, and symposia. We produce this podcast and a still feistier one about the evolving relationship between religion and democracy called Zealots at the Gate. And we are stewarding a budding institutional ecosystem animated by the Christian humanist tradition known as Breaking Ground. Comment readers are society's weavers, those community shepherds laboring to hold our social fabric together. And our job in all that we do is to help them, help you, rehumanize the age, equipping you with frameworks, stories, and exemplars to sustain your vocational joy, refresh your vision, and connect you with one another to effect real cultural change. Consider joining us. You can write, you can read, you can host a Comet Supper in your neighborhood, or attend one of our webinars with an author and your fellow readers. We want to equip you to be an agent of renewal in our time, and we need to learn from you. Write to us at podcasts@comet.org and expect a substantive exchange. We're honored to have you within our orbit and to pilgrim together toward wholeness in a world splintering against it. The Whole Person Revolution is hosted by Comet, edited by Becca Bruder, produced and with original music by Allie Crummy, audience strategy by Matt Crummy. I'm Ann Snyder, and I'll see you next week.